There you go.
All right. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we do get started, I'm not quite sure how much it's going to pick up what's going on around the room, but we are recording this for posterity. What we're doing today will be put on the Climate Action Plan website, just sort of so it's available to anybody, including those, right, who couldn't make it today. Just as a starting point, hopefully you've seen this QR code is also on these whiteboards over here. And then also, I think on a few tables, we have a survey where we're soliciting just a little bit more information about particular focus areas, interests, the things that you want to see in the plan, particularly with respect to climate justice and climate equity. All right. So today, let me just navigate away from that. We're talking about the university's climate action plan, right? I think we're all here in part because we're in agreement that climate action is necessary now. It has been necessary for a while, and institutions, much like our own, need to step up and make change, right, in order to address the climate crisis in a way that's effective, efficient, sustainable, just, and equitable. So that's at least how I would characterize why we're here today. And before I go on any further, I should introduce myself. My name is Karen Bailey. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies. I've been participating in the Climate Action Plan with the steering committee, the development of the plan, and along with the consultants, which you'll hear from a little bit later today. And in particular, I've been focusing with a team of wonderful people on the justice and equity components of the plan. So before we get started, I'm a teacher. I'm all about engaging, right? Getting everybody involved. I'm glad that you're here. I'm so glad you're here. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you're here. So quickly, I want to encourage you to, at your table, just check in with each other. Why did you show up to this event today? Why are you here? Why is this important for you? In addition to, I know Dr. Harrison encouraged a lot of her students to come, which is great. Yay for Jill's class. Okay, couple minutes, discuss. Why are we here? Oh, sorry. It worked. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to pause conversation. But again, in traditional sort of teaching practices, I'm going to ask for someone to share. So what did you talk about at your table? Why are folks here today? Absolutely. Love it. Yeah. And I think that's probably true for many of us, right? We hear about things that are going on. We might be taking action in our day-to-day, but when we think about an institution as as large as CU, it's easy to not think too much actively on a day-to-day about the action that's being taken. So how can we become more proactive and more engaged? Yeah, great point. And then also the accountability piece is, I think, near and dear to all of our hearts. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So I think I heard a couple of things there. One, right, is recognizing, particularly with respect to this section that's focused on justice and equity, the fact that climate change does not impact us all the same, right? And the systems that have led to climate change differentially impact different communities, different people, different parts of the world. And right, we need to be really centering equity and justice when we're thinking about climate action. And then similar thinking about responsibility and who's responsible and who has the capacity. Absolutely. I saw one more hand, so yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And, putting a name on it, and I think that's a good point. The comment that I just made is that climate change doesn't impact us all the same. And that's certainly true. Right. But there are certain communities that have historically been more impacted by environmental harms, environmental hazards, and environmental challenges, including climate change. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and their communities are included with them here in the United States and certainly globally as well. So absolutely, all of these things are things that we've been thinking about as we've been developing the plan. And so I'm going to give you a high-level overview of some of the ways we've been thinking about equity and justice. And then I'm going to task you, right, recognizing that those of us who have been doing this work for the last few months don't know everything, right? We don't have every sort of lens or angle as it relates to equity and justice. And so we're going to ask you to help us think through some of what we might be missing. So it takes us to the agenda for today's activities. We will be in this session focusing on justice in the action plan. At 2, we will be shifting over to talking about the climate action plan as a whole, led by our consultant project lead. There'll be a Q&A session, and then again, some breakout sessions where again, we're asking you explicitly to provide your expertise, to provide your perspective, to provide your suggestions, criticisms, whatever it may be, in a way that helps us meaningfully incorporate as many perspectives as possible into this plan. Okay, I want to start by just introducing the team that's been specifically kind of focused on climate action or climate equity and climate justice. So I've already introduced myself, Karen Bailey, Assistant Professor in Environmental Studies. I'll quickly ask Jasmine, then Aniket and Spencer to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Barco. I'm the Assistant Director of Energy and Climate Justice at the Environmental Center.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aniket Agrawal. I'm a student assistant, working with Jasmine, Karen, and Spencer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Spencer. I'm a first-year grad student in the MENV program, and I'm also on the equity team for the Climate Action Plan.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I've been doing a ton of work, right, collating data, putting things together, and really thinking about how we can center equity in this plan. All right. So just a little bit of a background on what we're doing and why we're doing it. In August 2009, CU's conceptual plan for carbon neutrality was completed. It was based on a 2007 campus-wide greenhouse gas reduction pledge. And it was really focused on shorter term goals to improve CU's carbon emissions trajectory as soon as possible, with a plan to develop some longer term strategies in the future. Back in 2009, this plan was maybe arguably progressive, and a lot of progress has been made, but we still need to do a lot better, right? There's many of the gains that we have made in terms of carbon emissions have been more limited than we would have hoped and have largely been due to actions of others, for instance, Excel. So the 2023 Climate Action Plan aims really to build on that work, with an emphasis on science-based targets for greenhouse gas reduction, increased emphasis on long-term resilience, improve stakeholder engagement and accountability with folks like you, and centering equity and justice throughout the plan. So the way that we've been thinking about climate justice and climate equity is really the intersection between environmental justice, a movement that came out of the environmental movement, which largely overlooked these differential impacts that certain communities were exposed to, particularly when thinking about environmental hazards, around waste management, around air pollution, and things like that. Social justice, broadly defined, thinking about equity in all of the systems within which we operate, and climate action, right? How are we going to take steps to mitigate climate emissions, climate change by decreasing emissions, and to adapt to changing environmental conditions as a result of climate change. And so together, we think of all of those theories, frameworks, ways of acting as really driving climate justice. Another way, just so we're all on the same page, we think about this, climate justice is the fair treatment of all people and the freedom from discrimination in the creation of policies and projects that address climate change, as well as the systems that create climate change and perpetuate discrimination. Right? So it's both backwards looking in terms of how did we end up here and how can we ensure that our actions don't exacerbate the inequity that already exists, and forward looking in terms of thinking about how can we build on social justice movements, environmental justice movements to ensure equity and justice are centered. So primary goals as we're thinking about this plan are focused on reducing further climate changes, adapting to the changes we have brought about already in the climate that we're currently experiencing, and really intentionally supporting people affected the most, burdened the most by those who have contributed the most, right? Those populations generally being different to climate change. All right. So some of the pillars that have guided this work are a just transition, right? Thinking about shifting, for instance, from non-renewable to renewable energy sources in just ways. Social, racial, and environmental justice, Indigenous climate action, doing what we can to center Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous ways of knowing and being and learning. Community resilience, right? Recognizing that as of now, things are likely to get worse. The impacts of climate change are likely to become more frequent, severe, and intense. So how can we build resilience into these systems as we're making change? Natural or nature-based climate solutions, and climate education and engagement in a way that supports accountability around the actions proposed in the plan. So some of the ways we're infusing justice throughout the plan is with outreach and engagement to identify some of the key topics, concerns, opportunities, and challenges to linking justice and climate action at the university. And so we've already done a bit of that work. We've had some workshops and focus groups. We've done some outreach beyond the CU campus to Boulder County residents as well to get some of their perspectives. And we are continuing to do outreach engagement, again, to really hear from the stakeholders who are going to be most impacted. We're also highlighting strategies that both decrease emissions and have the potential to improve or increase equity. And finally, we're doing sort of an assessment of the plan components overall from an equity perspective. And on the wall over here, you can start to see some of that. And then when we also task you with helping us out on this, that will also be an opportunity to see some of the ways we're thinking about that. So this is just an example of one of the recent activities that we had here in the UMC in February. We had invited folks from staff and faculty primarily, right, trying to get a combination of both those who might have some type of expertise as it relates to different components of climate and the way it operates in CU's campus, and then also working directly with staff, particularly frontline staff, those who are likely to be most impacted by some of CU's operations and by some of these actions we're likely to take to in the climate action plan itself. So the goal of this workshop was to start to brainstorm around some of the key themes that should go in the plan, some of the ways we're thinking about different aspects of the plan, and really get some initial stakeholder input with respect to it. And it was I think, a well-attended, fun day, and that has really informed how we have gotten to this point today, where we're going to be presenting some more sort of concrete actions within the plan. As we're thinking about sort of the way we've approached the plan overall and the development of the plan, in this same event, we had some table prompts. We had this Prouds and Sorries activity where we allowed people to really reflect on what is it that I'm proud of that the university is doing? What is it that I'm less proud of that the university is doing? And thinking about how we might be able to incorporate some of those sort of foundational ways of understanding university operations into the plan. And really just thinking about the myriad of ways that we might want to share or receive information and providing opportunities for folks to do that. So again, with our approach, we're trying to ensure equity is embedded throughout the plan, and we're trying to ensure stakeholder feedback is reflected within the plan. So I hope you know that we're really glad that you're here. And we really want to do what we can to hear from you and meaningfully include it in the plan. Just some quotes from that initial activity that we had. Divested communities are feeling climate change now. It's not a problem for the future, right? This urgency is something that's strongly felt. I don't have AC or air purifiers at home. When it's hot out and the air quality is poor, I still have to open my windows to keep my home cool, right? Just thinking about the way this is manifesting not only on CU's campus, but for the members of CU's community, right, who might have differential access to certain things in their homes and in their communities. We should be using carbon offsets to fund living learning climate action on campus, right? So specific suggestions of things that we might do to decrease emissions while creating learning opportunities for students. All of these are things that we are thinking about, actively trying to incorporate, and stressing over. So some of the specific things that we've started to identify are different projects, right, which achieve these dual goals of reducing emissions and improving, or at the very least, right, the lowest bar, not exacerbating inequity. So some examples in the transportation realm include eliminating price barriers to morning van pools for staff. So again, thinking about how people are moving from their home communities here to CU Boulder to work every day, right? And how can we increase access and equity to more sustainable travel options? Including basic needs food distribution for staff with van pool service, right? So similarly, thinking about sourcing sustainable food and providing it to people who might have a greater need for basic needs support and might have higher levels of food insecurity. Again, thinking about food and food production and food provisioning, increasing our sort of farm to table or farm to fork program, where we are supporting local producers, local agricultural producers here in the state, and also supporting livelihoods associated with that, and thinking about that with an equity lens and equity perspective. For instance, how can we better support women-owned farms, BIPOC-owned farms, for example, in getting food that's healthy and has fewer carbon emissions associated with it here on campus. A low carbon diet campaign on campus, right? Providing information to people who are buying food on campus about carbon that might be embodied in the production, transportation, processing, packaging, right, of all the food that we're consuming, and how can we get food on campus that has lower carbon emissions associated with it. Some other examples when we're thinking about waste and waste reduction. BioCore, right? So when we're thinking about the laboratory spaces on campus that produce a lot of waste and use a lot of energy. How can we think about surplus donations of scientific instruments across campus and getting that into K through 12 classrooms where learning might be going on that we can support through our activities and minimize waste? A computers to youth program, right? The campus community goes through a lot of computers over time. So how can we restore those and get those to students who are in need, again, with the emphasis on K through 12. So thinking about not in addition to just minimizing waste, but also thinking how we can sort of divert waste to communities that might have greater needs. When we're thinking about energy and energy production, right, of course, one of the biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, broad energy conservation campaigns that involve both behavioral change and behavioral recommendations for people living on and around campus, and then also just doing better to improve our buildings. So we have a few examples that were shared later about how we're going to more sustainably build new buildings on campus, and then also how we're going to potentially retrofit existing buildings around the goals of energy. All of which likely to also have an equity component related to utilities as well. The off-campus flows program, which actually I should ask Jasmine to speak about. Do you want to briefly? You've been heavily involved with that. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Yeah. The Flows program is our community facing program where we train community members on just various things that they're interested in. This year, they've really been interested in weatherizing, as well as soil building, soil health, and local like community gardens. So they've been building a lot of community gardens in their dwelling places, and they're about to go through a weatherization training and certification as well.
Yeah, so how can we use the expertise that we have at this campus on sustainable building, on sustainable food production, on sustainable weatherization to support communities who might have those desired needs, right? Making better relationships between the campus community and the broader CU community that we serve. So another piece of this effort, and again, this is something that you'll see shortly when we provide you with this information and something that's reflected on the wall, is an equity assessment. Might be a strong term at this point, but sort of an equity statement or equity evaluation, right? Where we have particular strategies, continue to reduce package-related plastic waste by sourcing products with sustainable packaging, right? And so that's obviously good for carbon emissions, obviously good for reduction of plastic waste, but thinking what the equity implications are of this type of action. Reduction in plastic waste is broadly beneficial, right? We all benefit by having less plastic in the environment, but has the potential to decrease waste in marginalized communities, particularly those where landfills might be sited. But right, when we're thinking about equity, there are potential for trade-offs. And similarly, when we're thinking about different actions within the plan, there might be trade-offs. So there could be potential trade-offs if costs of shifting from plastic increases costs to consumers on campus, right? So these are things that we're considering with each of the different sort of strategies that are being presented in the plan. And this is definitely a space where we want additional input. Okay, so now here's where, actually, before I ask you to do any work, I might pause here for any high-level questions that you think would be helpful for others to hear. Yeah, I appreciate that question. It is an important one, and I think it's one of the biggest ones that we're struggling with. And I think it's worth noting, right? Some of the reasons the gains from the 2009 conceptual plan for carbon neutrality that weren't as large as proposed is in part due to sort of limited accountability in the implementation of the plan. So I would start by saying, tell us your suggestions. We want to hear about what you think in terms of accountability. But things that we're considering, A, is transparency and data availability, right? So when Blue Strike shares next, they'll talk a little bit about the scenario planning tool and the way that we're going to make the information available online, updated at least annually, right? Here are the changes that we've made. Here are the decreases in emissions that we've seen. Here are the other outcomes that we can measure, right? So a starting point of transparency. I think the other ways are around communication. We're thinking about regular newsletters, regular focus group meetings, right? Regular ways of sort of just communicating what's going on with respect to the plan. That said, right, so that's where our thinking is, making sure the data is available, making sure the university is reporting regularly and communicating regularly to the entirety of the CU campus. But that doesn't ensure accountability, right? It ensures that people have some sense of what's going on. But there's this next step and this next piece that, quite frankly, it's probably above my pay grade in terms of how this plays out in reality. But I think the reality is that we're hoping to set up within this plan a strategy for implementation, which is going to likely include some representation and some I think accountability, particularly with respect to undergraduates, right? And having undergraduates be involved in the implementation and some of the reporting around planning. But I think there's a lot of additional considerations that need to go into it in terms of accountability. But we are thinking about it. We're actively thinking about it, and we're trying to figure out what might be the best strategies to ensure accountability. The funding piece is oh, do you want to? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. And then I just wanted to add, right, multiple people, including somebody who just walked in from the university's Office of Sustainability and Infrastructure and Sustainability are on the committee, right? And so decision makers are involved, including folks who also have information about funding, funding streams, funding availability, funding limitations, also on the committee and can provide some sort of bounding for some of the proposals that we have. But definitely want additional thoughts on what happens, right? What happens if we don't reach these goals, right? And how are we going to A, ensure that doesn't happen, and B, hold the sort of future decision makers, current and future decision makers accountable. I don't want to spend too much time on questions. I see one more hand. I just want to make sure you get some time to work on the things that yeah.
I just have a question. So is this, like everything you've been talking about seems specific to the University of Colorado Boulder campus. So I wanted to know, what does the interplay with the other campuses in the University of Colorado system as a whole, including the administrative and investment processes?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a particular area. Actually, Heidi just walked in, so I might ask Heidi or Chris to speak to that. Specifically, right? So I think as a starting point, right, we are making a plan for the University of Colorado Boulder, and the steering committee and the people on the steering committee only have sort of purview over CU Boulder's campus operations. But I think the intention, right, is to share the planning process, share additional information, and ensure that there's sort of ongoing communication and feedback across the CU system. I would give Heidi or Chris an opportunity to add anything. Okay, feels sufficient. Yeah, and I would fully acknowledge, right, that is a limitation of this approach and this plan. And I also want to acknowledge there are many limitations, right, to this approach and this plan. It doesn't mean it's not worth doing, right? And it certainly doesn't mean it's not worth soliciting input that might include reference to those limitations from impacted stakeholders. Okay. Again, thanks for being here. So, as I mentioned, right, the Climate Action Plan team, we're not experts on all of the myriad of ways that equity and justice intersect with climate action, not by a long shot. So what we're asking you to do for the next 20-ish minutes or so is work at your table to take a moment to help us identify some of the equity strategies and implications of the draft plan components. Really, really important to note, everything that we're presenting today is in draft form, right? We're doing this, we've made progress, we've started suggesting things, but we haven't decided officially what's going in the final plan. We haven't decided how to prioritize what's going in the plan. We are hoping to push the plan further than it is right now. So basically what we're showing you are similar to this slide, right? 4 different sectors: waste, transportation, infrastructure, a few different strategies that are currently proposed to be in the plan, and their equity statements associated with them, and higher level goals. And what we want you to do is write on this butcher paper, what's missing, what's wrong, what could be better, what are the implications that we're missing, right? How else can we be thinking about particularly equity, but also feel free to just comment on anything that's within an individual action as well. Yes. Is that clear what your task is and what we want from you, wonderful stakeholders who decided to show up today and give your time to this effort? Okay, we'll walk around, happy to continue having discussions, answering any questions that we're able to. But yeah, for now, we're putting the work on you for a minute.
I need my tech support. So I wanted to just briefly introduce, again, my name is Kristen. I'm with Blue Strike. There are 4 teams that are making up the Climate Action Plan consultant team. With me here today, I have Rich Swanson. He's going to talk to us today about greenhouse gas inventories and then how we are generating scenario analysis around the projects that are being considered. And we also have Brian Stern, who is here today from GLUMAC. And Brian is going to present today on renewable energy, the transition of fleet to EV, and building decarbonization. So, but first I wanted to highlight the incredibly smart Climate Action Plan Steering Committee. It's been an honor to work with them. We meet once or twice a week, and they have been the guiding voice in the planning process so far. We have, I'm not going to list them off, but we have folks from finance, operations, we have our sustainability director, we have research associates and renewable energy specialists, and we are working with the director of finance. So we have a lot of support, and then Karen with equity, she's helping guide the process. So I'm really thrilled to be working with that group. I should say that there are a lot more folks involved, and I encourage anyone who really wants to be more involved to speak up. We would love to talk with you personally or as a group. We have done many focus groups so far, and so today is kind of the first day that we're kind of bringing you some recommendations that were based on some initial conversations. But again, we're just at the beginning stages of this. So the agenda today is just to go over, as I said, a lot of the GHG reduction goals. And then we are going to have a lot of time for Q&A if you guys want to dissect some of those recommendations. And then based on the attendance, we're going to do some breakouts, and I'll give you some more information at the end of this hour on that. And then we'll come back for some wrap-ups. Karen already did it, so I'm going to speed through this. But why are we here? What's the journey been for CU? And it all started in 2007 when the chancellor signed the president's climate action, or I'm sorry, Second Nature climate commitment. And so with that commitment, the campus set a goal to achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible. That was what the commitment stated. So they went on, and by 2009 had written a conceptual plan for carbon neutrality, which is really the starting point for this entire discussion around greenhouse gases. So we're using that to kind of launch into the next rendition. Time did pass, but the energy master plan then was written. And so the energy master plan gives us a lot of current data to work with as we're trying to figure out what our new targets might be. And then in 2022, the campus wrote their inaugural system-wide sustainability report. And so here we are today, 2023. The planning process so far, again, really quick. We came on campus last October. We had a bunch of focus groups with different department heads, et cetera. And then we kind of went back and forth with the CAP steering committee, had several discussions over the Q4, Q1, and now here we are in April, ready to have a serious discussion about recommendations that we've made, and what some of the barriers and challenges might be that you know about and we might not, et cetera. So again, the purpose of today, we're going to focus on greenhouse gas emission reductions. For those of you who want to learn what additional items we're working on, I've put out all the goals and strategies across all scope 1, 2, and 3. So please write your comments. You can write them anyway. You can do that as you're leaving. So we want to get your feedback. That's the primary purpose for today. And we want to really discuss how to infuse equitable climate solutions. So thank you, Karen, for leading us in that journey. And we want to present recommended strategies so that before we get too far in the planning process, we've gotten the input that we need, and to understand scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the original target was in 2007, and these were the targets: 20% GHG reductions by 2020 from a 2005 baseline. That only included scope 1 and 2. It also fell a teeny bit short of our goal. And so we're here today to try to figure out what a more improved framework would be for accountability reporting, which we'll talk about some of the solutions around reporting. The governance ideas are up on the wall. So we're really trying to figure out how we can do better. And the second two goals, 50% GHG reductions by 2030 and 80 reductions by 2050. So that was the old goal. And now we're entering kind of a new timeframe where we really, we want to get serious. We are, again, 50% reduction in scope 1 and 2 by 2030. We think that's achievable. But this is what I wanted to talk about, and then I'll pass it in a minute to Rich. But we want to include scope 3. We would like to align this planning process as much as we can to align with the science-based initiative. And that's not going to happen in year 1, but we want you all to know that over the course of a few years, we will keep that into our planning process and integrate solutions for all scope 3, 50% reduction in certain scopes by 2030. And again, Rich is going to explain why it's only certain, but then moving beyond all categories. But it's just going to take us a couple years to get to that point, but that is our target. So as I mentioned, there are 3 pathways, in my opinion, to climate action planning. One is equity, making sure that that's integrated greenhouse gas emission potential, which is what we're going to focus on today. And the third is more of the sustainability items such as water, procurement, things like that. And then I guess I could add a 4th one, which is governance. So these are all preliminary, but these are the 5 core goals that we've established. The first 2 address carbon neutrality by 2050. 3, 4, and 4 address governance and communication and engagement. And the 5th one is around equity. And I should say, core goal number 1 is scope 1 and 2. Goal number 2 is scope 3. So that's kind of the structure of the plan as it stands now. So again, you can look on the wall and fill in the blanks there. And the last slide I have, again, to talk about equity is we've also, if you look on the wall, we've also put the colored chart right there is a way that we're going to design and present the equity statements that we're identifying. How can those, how are these strategies that we're coming up with, how are they going to impact different communities across campus? We want to actually tie a very specific thread between those 2 things, and we can do that visually. And so we just brought some examples of how we plan to do that. Now I'll turn it to Rich to talk about the greenhouse gas inventory.
Thanks, Kristen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start out by saying that I'm a proud CU alum and very happy to be back on campus here this spring. So it's great to see everybody and see the campus in all its splendor. So we're going to talk a little bit here about GHG inventories. And you can see up here on the slide a couple of panels. On the left side, we have a listing of our different scopes and the emissions that we have tracked thus far. On the right side, there is a graphic that shows basically the same thing. For those of you who don't know, just a quick note to perhaps the uninitiated, scope 1 emissions are essentially what emissions are being produced on campus by on-campus activities and things under the direct control of the University of Colorado. Scope 2 is purchased electricity and the emissions that result from that electricity being generated and transmitted. And then scope 3 are sort of supply chain and distribution chain emissions, that those emissions are somewhat out of the direct control of the university, although the university certainly has influence or may have influence in those scopes or in those particular categories. So you can see from our data collection and analysis so far, scope 1 emissions equals, you can see the totals up there, about 49,000 metric tons of CO2 for scope 1 in 2019, which we are using as our baseline year, particularly due to the effects of COVID on subsequent years. Then scope 2 for electricity is almost 86,000 metric tons, and then scope 3 based on a partial accounting, and I'll dive into this a little bit later with what's been included so far and what has not been included so far, about 67,000 metric tons. That breaks down to a percentage of about 24% for scope 1, 43% for scope 2, and 33% for scope 3. And I want to come back to those numbers in a little bit, but first of all, let me talk just a bit about scope 3 emissions and what we are tracking thus far. For those of you who are familiar with scope 3, you know that the data collection can be quite significant and a fairly heavy lift. And so what we've done is we have moved forward where data is available and collected that data and assessed it. You can see here all 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. You can see in the middle, the included column basically means that we are currently quantifying those emissions. The benchmark, we've chosen Stanford University as a benchmark and are tracking with Stanford for which categories they have. And so we're sort of comparing ourselves to Stanford University. And then you can see some notes over there on the side. So in the first couple categories, data is not yet available for purchased goods and services, which I should mention is likely a large quantity of emissions that we are not currently tracking. And so currently, our plan is to include steps for future data gathering and measurement in the years to come. We are tracking with capital goods, especially construction and square footage growth on the campus. Fuel and energy related activities also included. Upstream transportation and distribution. This is another area which unfortunately data is not directly available. And so we will include steps for future data gathering efforts and calculations there. And then you can see in waste, business travel is basically campus funded airline travel. And so we're counting that, commuting based on transportation surveys. And then category 9 says downstream transportation and distribution. This is another one that I'll come to here in just a moment when we talk a little bit more about some of the other scope 3 categories. We do have some initial sort of back of the envelope calculations for that and are basically right in the middle of sort of scoping that out and determining exactly where that should fall. So here is scope 3 in a little bit greater detail. You can see, for example, the large green section here on the bottom of the graphic, financed campus paid air travel. That right now is the single largest that we are measuring. I wanted to mention this embodied carbon from buildings, the way that we have measured that. There are a couple different ways. One is through sort of a life cycle analysis. The other is through a per building, for example, how much emissions are associated with that particular building the day that it opens. And what we have done is we have done a life cycle analysis of current additional square footage that has happened since 2007 and averaged that over time. And those are where those emissions are coming from. So we take those growth emissions and then we assess an emissions factor to that. Down here in the bottom, I wanted to point out this additional category, and this goes back to that category 9. It is possible that we could include student travel, particularly required student travel, which we might view as trips back and forth around the times when campus is open and closed. If we did that, you can see the numbers down there. This is very back of the envelope because we don't have adequate data or precise data about that. But these are back of the envelope estimations for what that might look like. And then there's another line down there of the 51,661 metric tons. This would be additional, perhaps non-required travel that would come as parents are visiting or students take extra trips. besides maybe 4 trips each year. And that total, if you can't see it well, is 51,661. So I wanted to point these numbers out. If we were to go back to our original percentage breakdown, in which scope 1 and 2 and 3 were presented a couple of slides ago, you saw that scope 3 came in at about 33%. If we added even the top line here, and then we're able to collect data from procurement, we would be above 40%. Just this number would put us up to about 43%. The reason that that's important is because in the Science-Based Targets Initiative that Kristen mentioned, once scope 3 emissions surpass 40%, a more detailed level analysis and accountability framework is asked for. And so we're monitoring that, talking about that with the steering team, and scoping that out in the best way possible, looking forward to the additional data that may come from it. So I will be back to talk a little bit about the scenario analysis that we've done, but for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Rich. And thanks everyone for being here. We wanted to provide some insight into the specific strategies around scope 1 and 2 emissions. I wanted to share both what are the strategies we're looking at, how are we going about assessing those, and really provide some information and transparency around that. I will say everything is still very much a work in progress, so please keep that in mind. We're still running our modeling, we're evaluating different assessments, looking at costs. So everything presented here is still a draft. We're still working on it and finalizing this for the ultimate plan later this year. Optiny on our team is leading the fleet electrification and charging efforts. The way we've approached that is gathering a lot of information around CU Boulder's existing fleet, pulling in fleet databases, fueling logs, and assessing all the inventory of vehicles and identifying electric vehicle opportunities and developing a procurement plan. One of the strategies that we are looking at is there currently are challenges within the campus of how fleet and campus-owned vehicles are managed at different departments. So opportunities of potentially consolidating or improving the way fleets managed. So more to come, and this is definitely an ongoing assessment. To support that fleet electrification, we're also studying the charging infrastructure that's required. Where do we charge? How do we charge? How do we consolidate different domicile locations? So again, developing a phased transition plan of how do we build out that infrastructure to support the transition of vehicles from fossil fuel based to electric. So again, more to come, and there's more information up on the papers on the wall. In general, want to talk now about the decarbonization approach for the campus and energy systems, which is the largest source of direct emissions from the university, both from natural gas as well as imported electricity. In general, the overall approach that we are taking is first prioritizing reducing loads. It is critical, especially as we're looking at electrified technologies, reducing loads to make that more manageable and more cost effective. Boulder's Energy Master Plan, which is posted on their website if anyone's interested, provides a lot of information around strategies for reducing building energy load, and we're using that as a key part of this climate action plan. The next is clean power. We know that Xcel is decarbonizing their electricity power supply, which will support the overall climate action plan. That doesn't take away from the need to reduce energy directly on campus, but it does allow for other opportunities such as electrification to support and leverage that clean electricity moving forward. So this is the overall framework that we're using to evaluate our strategies and really prioritize how we're addressing reducing the energy-related emissions on campus. A quick overview of what Xcel's commitments to reducing carbon are. By 2030, Xcel is committed to 80% renewable power, and by 2050, they've committed to carbon-free power. So with all of our scenario modeling, we've included those projections to understand what that looks like within the business as usual case. We are also considering that so that we can understand what is our emissions reductions accounting for the way Xcel's reductions are, so that we can understand what are the direct actions on campus and how does that contribute beyond what we are afforded from the utility supplied power, although that is a critical pathway and way of reducing emissions. So the existing buildings on campus is a key aspect of the climate action plan and pathway to reducing emissions. The Energy Master Plan, which I mentioned, is posted online, provided an assessment of the campus, identified strategies. So we're including those strategies within this. Those include updating lighting, doing lighting retrofits, doing retro commissioning of buildings, upgrading mechanical systems, as well as improving the envelope to reduce heat loss during the winter and heat gain during the summer. In total, the strategies that were identified during this plan could result in 29% reduction in energy use and would reduce annual metric tons of emissions by 33,000. This shows sort of the trajectory of each of those emissions. As part of the Energy Master Plan, a recommendation was to engage an energy service contracting company. What that means is there are companies that will provide and pay for the upgrades to buildings and use the savings from those projects in order to finance. So there's an ongoing study with an energy servicing company on campus providing investment grade audits for those buildings and working to put together a proposal for over 15 buildings. So this is one of the first steps in a really a great pilot to understand, how can these alternative financing options be used. So more to come soon from that study, but it's definitely funding and financing is critical as part of this. So there are active ways of looking at piloting other financing strategies to pay for these infrastructure upgrades. Around existing building decarbonization, in addition to the core infrastructure upgrades, there are other strategies that we're looking at of first recommending and prioritizing space optimization. How can we use the existing buildings more effectively? How do we expand some of the successes Boulder has had, such as the Green Labs program? How do we expand funding for deferred maintenance? A lot of the projects that are identified in the Energy Master Plan are from buildings that do have deferred maintenance. Equipment is beyond its expected useful life. And then how do we identify deferred maintenance projects that also help reduce emissions and prioritize those? And then finally, how do we develop retro commissioning opportunities? This is generally the most cost-effective way of reducing energy, and a lot of interesting opportunities at other universities where students have been engaged in retro commissioning projects. So in full, we are looking at both, what are the infrastructure, what are the core upgrades we need, and what are other programs and policies that we can integrate into the campus to support reducing energy. In addition to existing buildings, we want to make sure that any new buildings that we're building doesn't further contribute to the energy use on the campus. So as part of this, we are recommending and identifying what are the key design strategies that we want to make sure are incorporated into new buildings. The first is we want to look and assess and study electrified building systems as a way of leveraging Excel's reduced power carbon content in the future. Embodied carbon is a big aspect. As part of this, we will be having new construction projects do a full life cycle assessment, understand what the embodied carbon is. Colorado as a state has recently passed legislation around reducing embodied carbon emissions. So we're currently developing and studying different strategies for what can we do to go beyond what the bare minimum, what the legislation requires. But the first step is really having a better understanding of what those emissions are so that we can understand where there are opportunities. Right now, our current projections are based on averages. So I think over the next few years, as more buildings and the capital program moves forward, there'll be a lot more data, a lot more insight that we can use to inform the building program moving forward. The next is around establishing building performance targets, low temperature hot water, making sure buildings can support a higher efficiency heating system in the future, which we'll touch on, enhanced building commissioning, as well as responsible material sourcing. So these are just a few. The Climate Action Plan isn't doing a comprehensive review of campus standards, but is identifying, what are the key strategies we need to look at. On renewable energy, the overall approach to renewable energy is one, how can this provide and increase resilience on the campus? What's the intersection of electric fleets, building microgrid technologies, and really understanding and recommending energy projects as a campus living lab and leveraging some of the research that is ongoing both at Boulder and partner organizations at NREL. From renewable energy, we have provided a PV siting assessment, financial analysis. We've looked at different distributed solar PV opportunities as well as battery storage, which we found based on current utility rates is not a cost-effective strategy. However, it is a technology that could be cost-effective in the future as Xcel decarbonizes their power supply and increases towards 80% renewables. We expect the utility rate structures to change, which will make battery technology a more viable and financially viable solution in the future. So not something we are considering right now, but definitely a strategy to monitor for the future. I'm also looking at other opportunities to pilot technologies such as solar PV and thermal systems. The central plant on campus is the largest source of emissions for CU Boulder. Just for some background, the way Boulder's campus is heated is provided through a network of steam that is located throughout the campus. There's a large central utility plant as well as a satellite plant location. I just want to say there's an ongoing study outside of the Climate Action Plan that's really going into a more technical analysis of how do we transition from that current steam system, which relies on natural gas, to one that is lower carbon. That study is really going to inform and provide a lot more clarity around what is that timeline, what is that pathway. Current preliminary cost projections are the transition can cost anywhere from $500 to $700 million. So it's a significant investment. Some of the challenges are a steam system in itself isn't able to electrify. We first need to transition from steam to lower temperature hot water. In order to do that, we need to make sure buildings are able to be heated by lower temperature hot water. There are some buildings on campus that currently rely on steam. We then need to work back from the furthest point of campus back to the central plant and transition all of the network of steam to a hot water system. So there's a lot of costs associated with that. It is a challenging, complex project, but something I think the campus is really taking seriously and working with another engineering firm to provide that technical analysis and really understand, what is this going to require, both starting at the buildings and working all the way back. So in general, lower temperature hot water, how can we convert from natural gas? What's the right approach? What is the phased approach of doing that? How do we do that in a financially responsible way? How do we implement energy recovery? So in general, there's work starting right now, both first to understand what is required, then how can we reduce hot water temperatures? How do we upgrade buildings with the current investment grade audits which are going on? And then there's a study of a lot of different central plants of how do we incorporate heat recovery technologies? What about geothermal, heat pumps, hydrogen? So there are a lot of technologies that are currently being assessed as part of that. So as part of our climate action plan, we'll be leveraging the engineering work of that, and there will be additional information to come. But just want to stress that we definitely recognize that this is a challenge. It's something that we are working on, and I think there will be a lot more to share in the future. I will turn it back over to Rich to talk about how the culmination of these strategies will be incorporated in the climate action plan.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the scenario analysis component that we've been working on. And in order to sort of set that up, I wanted to first of all display our benchmarks. These are things that we are using, both trends and static figures that we are using to compare the different groupings or allocations of projects over time. So you can see up at the top, the dotted line right across the top is the baseline. I mentioned 2019 for a baseline. So that takes 2019 emissions and simply projects it forward. The dark black line is a business as usual line. The reason for the downward slope and then the more gradual downward slope is that basically tracks with Xcel Energy's decarbonization commitments. And so all the decarb that one is receiving from a business as usual approach is coming from Xcel Energy. Then you can see the two dashed lines, the brown dashed line with the dot in the middle, it would be the science-based targets for the University of Colorado, which encourages a short-term goal. And in our case, we have aligned the short-term goal with 2035 and then a longer-term goal, which has been aligned with 2050 in the graphic. The gray line you can see is the University of Colorado's commitments that Kristen shared earlier. And so you can see our benchmarks here. I should point out this is for scopes 1 and 2. Scope 3 would be a separate benchmark with separate measurements. And so unfortunately, we haven't fully broken out all of our analysis for scope 3, but those assessments will be part of the climate action plan as well, and taking a look at each component that we have, and then looking at reductions from each individual category within scope 3. So here are the scenarios. You can see from top to bottom, we have our business as usual scenario, which was displayed in the solid black line on the previous slide. Then we have scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we have sort of amalgamated the different projects into groups and assessed them against both the baseline and the business as usual scenario. Starting on the far right-hand side of the slide, you can see that all the scenarios include the vehicle fleet strategies that Brian suggested or talked about earlier. They also all include the renewable energy strategies that Brian discussed. Moving from right to left, the central heating plant projects. For the scenario 1 analysis, no central heating plant projects have been included, but for scenarios 2, 3, and 4, they have. And so I'll show you here in just a minute graphically just what that looks like. Then the energy efficiency programs are introduced in incrementally or accelerated investment levels, which simply do implementation scheduling faster. And then you can see the very rough order of magnitude costs in the final column moving to the left over towards the scenarios. So this slide here shows all those scenarios overlaid against the benchmarks. And you can see our scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. That light blue line was scenario 1. Once again, the big distinguishing factor for scenario 1 is that the central heating plants, central utility plant projects are not included there. And so you can see that it comes down with the building efficiencies, but then relatively tracks with just a little bit below what we're getting from Excel. The other 3 scenarios, red, green, and purple, are the building efficiencies plus the central heating plant projects. And you can see the slightly more aggressive investment schedule in the purple line that reduces overall carbon by a greater quantity. Eventually, they sort of merge around the 2035 timeframe and move forward from there. Those scenarios all do beat both CU's commitments and the science-based targets commitments for scopes 1 and 2, and eventually come down to a zero carbon picture. So I am going to, for our last slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen, who will close us out before Q&A.
Great. So in terms of next steps, we're going to continue to refine the scenario process. I would again encourage you all to look at some of the strategies that make up the scenarios. They're all written out on the wall. We're going to consider operational and financial feasibility. We are working with the Vice Chancellor, CFO, every month to really take a hard look, a realistic look at what is feasible and what is relevant and how that cash flow would work. We also have some other irons in the fire, such as the IRA funding, the Inflation Reduction Act funding, other things like that, that we're bringing to the table and going over that over time. We're going to conduct a prioritization process, which means that we take, once we determine the final strategies, which again, we'll be doing a lot of this stakeholder process between now and then to receive more input. But once we get to that final stage, we'll kind of set up a criteria. If a strategy brings in a high greenhouse gas emission potential, Well, maybe it gets higher up on the priority list, or if it doesn't, but yet it's got a large equity impact, then you understand. So that would be a way to kind of put strategies and project initiatives, behavioral change campaigns, which are on the wall, how to put that in a 5 to 10 to 20-year time horizon. And then translate that, okay, I got ahead of myself, time horizon for implementation. What that is one of the cornerstones of the work that we're doing here is we are going to make sure that the climate action plan doesn't sit on a shelf. We really want to make it realistic for for how to approach these commitments. And then obviously in the climate action plan and as a group with the committee, we're going to identify what needs to still be done beyond the climate action plan. And one of that is to continue to come up with a strategy for collecting scope 3 so that we can, be in line with the Science-Based Target Initiative. So with that, I've kind of handled more of the sustainability strategies that don't really have, they're more qualitative. That's water, procurement, grounds, things like that. So I'm happy to answer questions. Obviously, if you have questions about any of the data that you've heard, I can grab the other mic over there, and maybe I bet all the questions will be for you. So I'll bring the mic around.
Thanks so much for this great presentation. My question was back on a slide a while ago, between 2019 and I think it was 21, it looked like natural gas was going up significantly since 2019. I wondered what was happening there. This was like way back.
Oops. Yeah, so from let's see, from 45,000, this is metric tons of carbon. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. Those two numbers don't necessarily seem that different from one another over the course of a 3-year span. It could be that a building opened or something like that. I'm not sure. There might be somebody else who knows the answer to that. Why that number would yeah, Brian.
Yep, that drop, if you look, natural gas went up in 21. And I can't really see the numbers. I apologize. I don't have my glasses.
Yeah, so 2021 is higher than 2019.
Yeah, and then you'll see that purchased electricity dropped. So what we did is we operated our combined heat and power plant more. So we burned more natural gas and we purchased less power from the grid. Why did that happen? As a combination of, I think we had some storms that we operated our cogen plant, as well as we're in the Xcel's critical peak program where they call up our power to shave our campus off the grid because they have grid constraints at certain times of the year. And right now, natural gas is cleaner than the grid.
I have a couple questions about Xcel and the slide that you showed on their renewable energy projection. I'm not sure exactly. Yeah. Is it Brian? Brian. Okay. Yeah, that one. How believable or I guess, how trustable are Xcel Energy's projections? It seems like we're putting a lot of stock in them meeting these planned goals, and I'm skeptical about how do we trust them to meet those goals. For one, they are holding a hearing in July, I believe, with the legislature or with the PUC of Colorado, and I read that instead of shuttering one of their coal-fired plants for good, they are now projecting to convert it from coal to natural gas. So clearly that's got to make some difference in the amount of emissions that are coming from that particular plant. So again, my question is there a separate board that reviews Excel's projections? Do we have a recourse to actually know what they're doing? Is there separate measurement, a separate board that evaluates what's really going on? Or are we sort of taking on faith that they're going to hold up their end of the projection?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can't speak to the, governance of those commitments. I think within the way we're approaching this in the scenario planning tool, we are able to assess different scenarios, different emissions trajectories for Excel to really understand what is the risk of that. I will say in general, we do know that just from a financial perspective, renewables are more effective and cost effective. So we know that the emissions associated with Excel's energy is going to go down. From what we've seen, the last 5% is probably going to be the most challenging. So in general, we know that the carbon content of power is going to be a lot more, will be less in the future. It looks like Josh might be a good answer.
Those goals. All right. The states legislated those goals. So Excel started with a commitment and the state backstopped it. So Excel has to file their plan with the PUC each year through their integrated reduction target. So if it was a corporate commitment, I would have the same skepticism. So I'm happy that we have some state backing, which is, I think, what gives us confidence around it. Thank you.
So a little while back, we were talking about EVs, or like transitioning the fleet here on campus to EVs. And I wanted to ask two things. One is, so the actual way to get those EVs, is it through retrofitting those EVs or buying new ones? Because in my head, like if we buy new EVs, that is just total more things around, and say like, we push those EVs somewhere else, that's still, that hasn't really done a whole lot. And then two, so you talked about responsible material sourcing for buildings, but did not mention it for EVs as well. And I know that's a big problem. And so I just wanted to know if you could talk on both of those.
Yeah, I think on the fleet electrification side, we would be looking at a phased transition purchasing when vehicles reach the end of their life. So retiring existing internal combustion engine vehicles and transitioning to electric. That's why it is a phased transition for those reasons. And it enriches greenhouse gas accounting. We are accounting for the embodied carbon associated with electric vehicles as well as buildings to make sure that we are accounting for the carbon as well as the impact from those. So trying to develop a holistic, I guess, approach to that. Does that answer your question? Yes, I don't have a great answer for you, but we will certainly look into that and how we can integrate that into the climate action plan.
Our, just so you know, our fleet assessment team is not here today. They were, but I'm sure they know the answer and we can get back to you. I'm going to go over here.
Thank you so much. I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, it was mentioned that CU has missed the 2020 target by a tiny bit. That was 25% of the target. And this used 2020 data, which we have not used for the other things here. The miss would have been something like 66% with the 2020 data. And if we look at Excel, half of Excel's decarbonization has already happened. So if that had not happened, counterfactually, CO emissions would have gone up 16%. So that means that instead of going 20% down, we would have gone almost 20% up. So I think it's significant to appreciate this data and to acknowledge it in the context of accountability, in the context of building trust for the new climate plan. If we don't do that, I think we miss an opportunity to learn. The question is about the emission scenarios, and I'm trying to understand the emission scenario slide. I'm trying to understand a few things about this graphic. One is, it seems like scenario 4 is much preferable to the other scenarios, and it seems like the cost estimates are comparable. So what are potential objections to scenario 4, which just seems like by far the best? And I'm also trying to understand why there are these large kinks around 2034 and 2044 that do not seem to be accounted for in the narrative description. The narrative description also refers to actions taking place around the mid-2030s, but it seems like the major declines in the scenarios all happened before 2030. So just if we could walk through it a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So scenario 4 on the energy efficiency includes more building envelope upgrades, increasing insulation, improving windows. Those projects have much more significant operational impacts to the campus as far as operating those buildings, having swing space if a building is not being able to be used at the time of upgrades. So there are definitely considerations around that. I think the pilot project that's going on with the energy servicing companies and what they can finance, what are they willing to package into it is really going to inform some of these scenarios. So I think in general, the biggest difference between those is on the envelope measures, which are challenging just from, keeping the campus operational, not impacting students, not impacting faculty. So I think there's a lot of the pilot study that's going on, and the financing assessment for that is going to inform this. So hope that answers, but certainly the more we can do, the more we can finance within an energy servicing contract and meet the savings requirements, the better. And that is definitely an approach that is going to be used to free up capital for other projects. The kinks in the central plan, again, these are preliminary numbers since that study is ongoing. Those are really, excuse me, aligned around timelines, which are based on the equipment or the life of equipment. So at certain thresholds, once we've reached a critical mass of how much steam has been transitioned or how many buildings have been upgrades, it allows for new technologies to be integrated into the system. So there are going to be certain inflection points based on major shifts within technology. So these are preliminary numbers based on sort of the initial findings, and I think will continue to be revised, but there will be some periods of when there are larger shifts in emissions, just naturally based on the life cycle of equipment and how this would need to be phased over time.
I'll just make I guess a comment. I'm not sure what other opportunities there are to be a stakeholder in this process. I'm a professor here on campus. I've been teaching students for 15 years about climate change, about importance of doing things on climate change. We are the flagship campus in Colorado, I would argue. I know other campuses might, push back on that. And our state, since 2019, has done amazing numbers of new laws about reaching our climate goals. We have very aggressive, but yet I think reachable climate goals in this state. Our campus should be aggressive and really pushing to meet at least the challenge that our state has been put out. And I know this committee is really, I mean, I have friends with these people on this committee, and this is an amazing committee. I want to challenge our campus. Go for number 4, go for things as fast as we can, because this is a state where we've actually outlined a plan. And I think our campus should be trying to meet that goal. I am really also curious. I want to say there's lots of strategies, I think, beyond I know the finances is an issue. I know our existing infrastructure is an issue, but I have a feeling groups of donors could be mobilized, for example, to come up with green funding, bins of money to help achieve this goal. This is a very, I don't know, people would be excited to help the campus reach this goal. So I want to say those things. I want to ask about the 2 new dorms that are being planned for north of Boulder Creek right now. And what's the plan to try to electrify those dorms or build those dorms in a way that are looking ahead, since those buildings are going to be there for like 80 years or who knows how long those buildings are going to be there. We should be really pushing ourselves as a campus to be trying to go forward fast on this issue. I know that this is a big logistical issue. I appreciate our central plant. That's such a difficult thing to work with, but I guess my own students today, I'm asking them in the class, what do you think about tile roofs and the aesthetics of tile roofs versus having solar panels on the tile roofs? They're all like, go for the solar panels. This is our future. Okay, this is my little speech. I'm just saying, please, let's push forward as fast as we can on this.
I guess, is anyone from CU side able to speak to that?
On that microphone, you dial down, it's ringing. I don't know what
Sure.
this mic is really.
Yeah, the dorms are currently in design and we're designing them to be low temperature hot water dorms. We're still looking at the issue, but the likely scenario is to tie it to the central system that we have down there. The goal as we electrify is to electrify in a central fashion. And what the advantage of that is, it allows us to take advantage of the diversity of the different types of buildings we have, the diversity of heat loads versus cooling loads, transfer heat from one building to another. When we have that diversity in a centralized system, we'll operate much more efficiently. So we're not going to, at this point, I don't think the solution is to decentralize those 2 new dorms and put individual heat pump technology in that. We want to solve it in a centralized way. So if we can electrify the central system, that'll benefit campus in a much broader, more efficient way.
And the electrified will go to the hot water.
Exactly.
Would add to the renovation project is also.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. We're also working on the renovation of Helms. Helms, we're planning to, the design solution for that mechanical system is a low temperature hot water building. So anytime we touch a mechanical system, obviously within funds available and how much we can take down of the systems, we want to convert those buildings to low temperature hot water to allow us to implement those centralized solutions in the future. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm wondering, Rich, if I could put you on the spot, can you talk a little bit about her financial question, just some of the broad concepts that we've been talking with Chris about and or best practices that we've done elsewhere? Or whatever's in your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly say that, as part of the climate action plan will be sort of a menu of possible financing options. So, we're very involved in research to finding what different particular projects match up specifically with different projects match up with specific financing pathways. And so, sort of value or even capital stacking some of those projects where things that are savings can perhaps be banked over time, for example, and redistributed, especially if there are operational savings, to be able to bring those back into capital expenditure needs. Then you're sort of transferring savings that come from the OpEx side back to the CapEx side. So we're looking for availability for that. Kristen mentioned the IRA. Just a week ago, the federal government released a 100-page report on instructions for accessing, 30 those tax credits and other incentives that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're pouring through that right now, trying to see, exactly what matches up there. So yeah, with the ESCOs have been talked a little bit about. ESCOs are, that was originally a Department of Energy program. They've been fairly focused on energy projects specifically. There are other groups that are emerging that are willing to take on broader, sort of ownership or leasing arrangements with the campus, that many are backed by significant capital. And so those are also things that we're looking into as well. So there are a variety of different options. Josh. Yeah. Oops. Yeah, and the range goes from 650 up to, almost $1 billion. I mean, these are not cheap, obviously not cheap projects. I think we have one more question back here.
Yeah, so amongst CU students, there's growing concern about CU's fossil fuel investments. Is there any plans to include the investment portfolios related emissions in scope 3, or at least make those investment portfolios more transparent? And if not, what are the barriers to that? Bridget, do you have anything to add? No.
Yeah, that's a great question on, sort of the investment categories, that will, that all those categories. I mean, we don't have any information about that right now, to make a good assessment. But all those categories will be clearly spelled out, and sort of pathways towards accessing future information and digging into, all those categories, I think are, certainly can play a role. I don't know if there's another comment out there about that particular category.
And then I want to follow up with your document this morning to get some feedback, because we feel like what we presented today and what you might find on the wall or through a discussion, I think we're covering all your concerns. We'd love to convince you of that.
I'm on the, I'm on the executive committee of the Boulder Faculty Assembly. So keep pushing us. Come see us again before the end of the semester, perhaps. I wore my orange beanie yesterday, so we're on your side. We just need you guys and your enthusiasm to keep pushing. So make us listen, all of us here.
You could tell them about when you were a student. You said they were sleeping outside.
Yeah, when I was a student, it was the townships that it was divestiture from the townships that, or from South Africa rather, due to racial policies from the South African government. And hundreds were right outside, sleeping in cardboard boxes for a couple of months.
I would just add, I mean, when we scoped this climate action planning, the steering committee people here, we deliberately omitted category 15, which is the investments, not because we think it's not important, but because we sort of thought there's a general progression where a lot of companies, like best practice would be to tackle 1 through 14 because it's sort of a manageable thing to do, and then move to 15. So if the recommendation is that it should sort of layer in, I think most of us probably agree. It's also handled, I don't know this as well, but differently within the sort of CU system. So we're talking about endowments and so forth. We're talking about the campus, and I'm channeling what Heidi just told me. But that would sort of happen at the some other word level. So I think system level, thank you. So I think the recommendation is valid, but as we sort of draw circles that we're working on, it is taking that's sort of a conversation outside, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't take place, or that, we wouldn't have as a recommendation that that's the right sort of next step. So the question is appreciated. You want to add?
You guys are well aware that the Treasury Fund and the endowment are managed at the system level. I know that. But the good news is that what this climate action plan represents with all the money that's being talked about is absolutely positive on the investment side toward a net zero future. And we will be a customer in the broader economy of helping to make that happen. Just pointing that out too.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the willingness to continue the conversation. Just a quick comment on this past point was like an idea, even though investments are measured at the system level, they could be accounted for proportionally at the campus level in some way. And we'd be really interested in that as students. And then we had a question just generally, since you all do a lot of research, you're doing some research and recommendations into finance. Do you think in your past contracting experience, when you've worked with other institutions and organizations, have you provided recommendations on accountability measures? And could that be an area that you could provide research and like examples of how that could happen?
Well, I can try to tackle that one. I mean, definitely that's a very challenging one, and I'll stand over here. I have come up with some ideas on this governance thing, so I would recommend you looking at that. The first step that I took in trying to tackle that was to look at all the planning, the Zero Waste Board, the council, the Sustainability Council, what infrastructure, what framework is already existing to where we could have them hold some responsibility and deliver training, like through a train the trainer model where they're in charge of spreading the word and getting people on board. I also think there was a lot in your paper this morning that I think is on there about potential salary increases to, make people pay attention, those types of things. But, I think this campus already has a lot of that structure in place, but the Climate Action Plan has an opportunity to give them kind of guidance as to the, 3 things that they're responsible for. I should say that these all came from what I call a climate action tracker. And so they're cut and paste right from Excel. You don't see what's happening here. So what we have is we have goals, the equity statement, strategies, actions, and then it has timeline. It has who's responsible, and it has funding ideas or funding actual costs. And so we haven't done that part yet because we're still trying to figure this out. There's no reason to do that part yet until we finalize the strategies. So I think that's what we've done so far. But if anyone here had additional ideas, you can speak them out now, or if you think of them later, please write it so that I can take that back home with me. Any other questions? We are here till 4. The idea was that we were going to do some Q&A and then break out into breakouts, and we're happy to still do that. This is a small group, so I don't know if we were going to get into the weeds a little bit more on electric vehicles, renewable energy, really just the technical analysis. I'll be standing over here if you want to ask me some questions about any of the sustainability initiatives. But I think since it's such a small group, do you guys want to go next door, or do you want to? Yeah, just maybe whoever wants to talk with Brian and Rich more in depth. Let's move to that side, and then us sustainability folks will move to this side and I can talk further. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. It's been great to have you all, and we look forward to bringing you back. We don't have any plans right now for the next round of focus groups, but we will definitely, please look at the website. We do have a website now. So all the events are there and will be there. A lot of the PowerPoints that we're showing you will all be there. And I think it's being recorded right now. So all the recordings will be up there. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.